By the spring of 1945, the scales in the Pacific had decisively tipped in favor of the Allies. American forces, having traversed thousands of miles of bloody battles through Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima, drew closer to the Japanese islands. The empire of the rising sun, once dominant over half of the Pacific, was now cornered. Its fleet had suffered heavy losses, its air force was weakened, and its line of defense was shrinking like shagreen leather. But the Japanese spirit remained unbroken. Okinawa, the jewel of the Ryukyu archipelago, became the last frontier before the invasion of the Japanese homeland. Just 400 kilometers from mainland Japan, this island presented an ideal staging ground for the Allies' final offensive. For the Americans, the capture of Okinawa meant acquiring air bases in close proximity to Japanese cities. For the Japanese, the loss of the island opened the way to inevitable defeat. Both sides understood. The coming battle would determine the fate of the war. The Japanese command prepared for a desperate defense, while the Americans assembled the largest amphibious armada of the entire Pacific campaign. Okinawa is not just an island, but an entire Ryukyu archipelago, stretching in an arc between Japan and Taiwan for more than 1,000 kilometers. The island of Okinawa itself, about 130 kilometers long and only 4 to 32 kilometers wide, resembles a giant sea serpent in shape. Its strategic position, just 400 kilometers from the southern Japanese island of Kyushu, made it an ideal springboard for an invasion of the Japanese archipelago. From captured airfields, American bombers could easily reach the Japanese mainland, returning to base on the same day. Okinawa's landscape seems to have been created by nature for defensive operations. The southern part of the island is a real labyrinth of limestone hills, deep ravines, and caves. Here, the Japanese created an impregnable line of defense, turning natural caves into fortified firing points. The central part is relatively flat, with cultivated fields and villages. It was here that the main airfields of the island were located, which became the primary targets of the American landing. The northern part is a difficult terrain with dense forests and rocky cliffs, a real paradise for snipers and sabotage groups. For Japan, Okinawa had a special cultural significance. Although the inhabitants of the Ryukyu archipelago had their own unique culture different from Japanese, the island was considered an integral part of the Japanese Empire. Here was the ancient Shuri Castle, a symbol of the Ryukyu Kingdom, which existed before its annexation to Japan in the 19th century. Okinawans spoke their own language, had their own traditions and beliefs, formed under the influence of both Japanese and Chinese cultures. For centuries, the Ryukyu archipelago served as a bridge between the civilizations of East Asia, through which goods and ideas were exchanged. Okinawa was a buffer between the great powers of the region, China and Japan. Now, this paradise island was to become the arena of one of the most brutal battles in human history. The civilian population of Okinawa, numbering about 450,000 people, found themselves between a hammer and an anvil. The Japanese command viewed the island as the last frontier before the home islands, and therefore prepared to defend every inch of land with fanatical tenacity. The Americans, on the other hand, saw Okinawa as the key to ultimate victory over Japan, and were willing to pay any price for this strategic foothold. Operation Iceberg became the pinnacle of American military thought in the Pacific. In early 1945, Admiral Chester Nimitz and Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. began preparations for an amphibious operation unprecedented in the history of warfare. The scale of the conceived plan astonished even seasoned staff officers. The American command planned to deploy over 1,400 ships, including 40 aircraft carriers, 18 battleships, and numerous cruisers, destroyers, and auxiliary vessels. Air cover was provided by almost 3,000 aircraft of various types. For the landing on the island, the 10th Army was formed under Buckner's command, comprising 4 Marine divisions and 4 Army divisions, a total of about 180,000 personnel. Another 80,000 sailors and airmen supported the operation from sea and air. Preparations took months. Every soldier, every ship, every aircraft was to play its role in the gigantic spectacle of war. Aerial photographs of the island were meticulously studied, and detailed maps of the coast and interior regions were compiled. American intelligence estimated the Japanese garrison at 65,000 men, a figure that would later prove catastrophically underestimated. In reality, General Mitsuru Ushijima commanded over 100,000 soldiers, including the experienced 32nd Army and numerous units of local militia. American analysts also underestimated the scale of Japanese defensive fortifications. Intelligence reported the presence of fortifications along the coast, but failed to detect the true depth and complexity of the underground tunnels and bunkers created by the Japanese deep within the island. The U.S. command chose the western coast of Okinawa, near the village of Hagushi, for the landing. This area offered several advantages: relatively gentle beaches suitable for landing equipment, and proximity to the key airfields of Kadena and Yomitan. The landing was scheduled for April 1st, April Fool's Day, according to the Western calendar. This irony of fate did not escape the attention of many participants in the operation. Before the main forces landed, it was planned to capture the small Kurama Islands west of Okinawa to establish an anchorage for ships and a supply base there. Artillery and air preparation was to last several days to maximally weaken Japanese defenses before the Marines' assault on the shore. All these plans were based on the bitter experience of previous amphibious operations, especially the recent assault on Iwo Jima, where the Americans encountered fanatical Japanese resistance and suffered heavy losses. No one expected Okinawa to be an easy prize, but few imagined the true scale of the impending bloodshed. General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of Japanese forces on Okinawa, perfectly understood that his task was not to defeat the Americans, but to inflict such losses upon them that would force them to abandon the invasion of the Japanese islands. His strategy became a model of defensive art and bore bitter fruit for the attacking side. Ushijima, relying on the experience of previous battles, abandoned the traditional Japanese tactic of countering landings directly on the beaches. Instead, he created a deeply echeloned defense in the southern part of the island, turning the natural hilly landscape into a true fortress. Under his leadership, Japanese engineering units and thousands of mobilized Okinawans dug more than 60 kilometers of underground tunnels connecting bunkers, artillery positions, and command posts. The ancient Shuri Castle, transformed into an impregnable citadel, became the center of this defensive system. Multi-level fortifications allowed for maneuvering forces underground, unnoticeable to enemy aerial reconnaissance. Japanese soldiers could appear in unexpected places, strike, and then disappear underground again. Every hill, every ravine was turned into a defensive strongpoint with interlocking fields of fire. Artillery was carefully camouflaged and zeroed in on all possible enemy advance routes. Individual firing points were designed to withstand direct hits from heavy shells and aerial bombs. Ushijima positioned his main forces not on the coast, but deep within the island, luring the Americans into his defensive web. The psychological preparation of Okinawa's defenders was no less important than the engineering structures. Every Japanese soldier knew there was nowhere to retreat, only the sea behind them, and ahead, the sacred land of Japan. Officers instilled in their subordinates that their duty was to die with honor, taking as many enemies with them as possible. Soldiers wrote farewell letters to their families and swore to fight to the last bullet, and then use a bayonet, sword, or their bare hands. Each was given hand grenades not only for fighting the enemy, but also for suicide in case of capture. Special ceremonies were held in Japanese units during which soldiers symbolically said goodbye to life, becoming living dead, ready to fulfill their last duty to the emperor. The local population was actively involved in defensive works. Tens of thousands of Okinawans, including women, the elderly, and teenagers, dug trenches, built fortifications, and transported ammunition. Japanese propaganda instilled in the island's inhabitants that Americans were demons in human form who would torture and kill everyone indiscriminately. Many civilians were given bamboo spears and taught how to attack American soldiers in case of a breakthrough in the defense. School children were united into so-called blood and iron volunteer squads, preparing them for self-sacrifice in the name of the emperor. April 1st, 1945. The sunrise over the Pacific Ocean illuminated an unprecedented spectacle. An armada of over 1,400 ships surrounded the island of Okinawa. April Fool's Day became the day the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific Theater of Operations began. The irony of the date did not escape the American Marines, many of whom joked that the Japanese would mistake their landing for an April Fool's prank. At dawn, hundreds of guns from battleships and cruisers opened hurricane fire on the coastal strip. Heavy shells plowed the sandy beaches, turning presumed Japanese fortifications into craters. Wave after wave of bombers unleashed their deadly cargo on the coastline. The sea boiled from explosions, smoke shrouded the horizon. It seemed no living creature could survive under such fire. At 8:30 a.m., the first landing craft with Marines separated from the transports and moved towards the shore. Tension reached its peak. Veterans of Tarawa and Iwo Jima prepared for a bloodbath. Young recruits, going into battle for the first time, clutched their weapons with whitened fingers. Everyone expected a barrage of fire from the shore as the boats approached the beaches. But something astonishing happened. The shore was silent. The first waves of the landing force reached the Hagushi beaches unopposed. Marines leaped out of the boats, ready to take cover and return fire, but met only silence. Bewilderment gave way to cautious joy. Had the preliminary bombardment really destroyed all Japanese defenses? By noon, 60,000 American soldiers had already landed on shore. Resistance remained minimal. Sporadic sniper shots and a few small pockets of defense, which were quickly suppressed. American equipment, tanks, bulldozers, artillery, streamed ashore. The beaches, designated by code names green, red, blue, and yellow, were captured with astonishing ease. The first day of the operation went like clockwork. The 7th Infantry Division advanced through the central part of the island and by evening reached the east coast, effectively cutting Okinawa in half. The Marines captured Yontan Airfield, finding several intact Japanese aircraft there. American flags already waved over key heights. Command was encouraged. General Buckner reported an astonishing success to Washington. Casualties were minimal, only 28 killed on the first day, which seemed like a miracle after the bloody battles on Iwo Jima. Some officers even allowed themselves to dream of a quick end to the operation. But among experienced veterans of Pacific battles, unease grew. Where was the Japanese army? Why wasn't General Ushijima defending the beaches? What trap was he preparing? These questions troubled the American command, even as they celebrated the successful landing. The answer lay in the hilly terrain of southern Okinawa. There, in a labyrinth of caves and tunnels, 100,000 Japanese soldiers patiently waited for the Americans to enter their line of fire. Ushijima deliberately allowed the landing to proceed unopposed, luring the enemy deeper into the island, where a true meat grinder awaited them. The first day of Operation Iceberg created a dangerous illusion for the Americans. The ease with which they seized the beachhead and advanced forward fostered a false sense of security. No one yet knew that this battle would last almost 3 months and become one of the bloodiest in the history of the war in the Pacific. The capture of Kadena Airfield marked the first strategic success for the Americans on Okinawa. By the end of the second day of the operation, the Marines were in full control of this key objective. Engineer units immediately began restoring the runways, and within 3 days, the first American fighters landed at the former Japanese airfield. This drastically altered the balance of power in the air. Now, Allied aviation could operate directly from the island, no longer dependent on aircraft carriers. Simultaneously, the second major airfield, Yontan, was captured, where the Americans discovered several undamaged Japanese aircraft abandoned during the retreat. Admiral Nimitz, receiving the report of the airfield captures, called it a priceless gift. Indeed, having their own air bases on Okinawa allowed not only for supporting ground operations but also for more effectively repelling kamikaze attacks on the fleet. While engineers transformed the Japanese airfields into modern air bases, infantry divisions rapidly advanced through the central part of the island. By the evening of April 4th, leading elements of the 7th Infantry Division reached the eastern coast, effectively cutting Okinawa in two. The northern part of the island, mountainous and less populated, seemed almost devoid of serious defenses. The southern part, where the main Japanese forces were concentrated, remained an impregnable bastion. The American command decided to first clear the north, and then, with all forces, descend upon the southern fortified area. The 6th Marine Division was tasked with advancing north, while the main forces of the 10th Army prepared for the offensive to the south. The initial days of the operation created a deceptive impression of an easy victory for the Americans. Casualties were minimal, resistance sporadic. However, as the advance southward progressed, the nature of the fighting began to change. The first signs of well-organized defenses appeared. Snipers, skillfully camouflaged in natural cover, opened accurate fire on American soldiers. Night counterattacks by small groups of Japanese infantrymen became more frequent. Enemy artillery, meticulously concealed in the terrain's folds, began to inflict significant losses. Reconnaissance patrols sent southward reported an extensive system of trenches, bunkers, and firing positions. Aerial photography revealed signs of large-scale fortification work around the ancient Shuri Castle, located on a dominant height in the southern part of the island. Gradually, the outlines of a powerful defensive line stretching from the eastern to the western coast through the central high ground with Shuri Castle emerged before the American forces. This line, dubbed the Shuri Line, became the main Japanese line of defense. General Ushijima masterfully utilized the natural terrain, turning every hill, every ravine into a fortified area. The American command realized that the easy stroll was over. Ahead awaited a bloody battle for every meter of territory. The 10th Army began regrouping forces, bringing up heavy artillery and tanks to break through the Japanese defenses. The real war had begun. The Shuri Line became a masterpiece of defensive engineering and General Ushijima's tactical genius. Stretching from the eastern to the western coast, through the hilly terrain of southern Okinawa. This system of fortifications transformed the natural landscape into a deadly labyrinth. At the heart of the defense stood the ancient Shuri Castle, a symbol of the Ryukyu Kingdom, now converted into an impregnable fortress and the command post for Japanese forces. The defense system comprised 3 concentric lines with a total depth of up to 10 kilometers. Every hill, every ravine was integrated into a single network of fortifications. Japanese engineers created over 60 kilometers of underground tunnels, connecting bunkers, artillery positions, and command posts. These tunnels allowed defenders to move covertly between positions, undetected by American aerial reconnaissance. Artillery positions were meticulously camouflaged and positioned to provide interlocking fire across all possible avenues of American advance. Guns were set up in caves with narrow embrasures, making them virtually invulnerable to counterfire and airstrikes. After several shots, the crews would roll the guns deeper into the keevnings, change position, and open fire again from a different location. Machine gun nests were situated on hillsides to sweep all approaches to the heights. Many firing points had concrete shelters capable of withstanding direct hits from medium-caliber shells. To counter tanks, the Japanese prepared a network of anti-tank ditches and minefields, as well as numerous suicide squads armed with anti-tank mines. General Ushijima established his headquarters in deep underground tunnels beneath Shuri Castle. From there, he could coordinate the actions of all units, remaining beyond the reach of American artillery and aviation. A communication system, duplicated in case of damage, ensured reliable troop command. Ushijima's tactical plan was both simple and brilliant: to lure the Americans deep into the defense, wear them down in bloody battles for every height, every bunker, and inflict such heavy losses that the U.S. command would be forced to reconsider its plans for invading the Japanese home islands. When American forces approached the Shuri Line in mid-April, they encountered organized resistance on a scale that surpassed all expectations. The initial attacks were repelled with heavy casualties. Every step forward came at the cost of dozens of lives. Tanks got stuck in minefields or became targets for anti-tank artillery. Airstrikes and artillery bombardments seemed to inflict no significant damage on the Japanese fortifications. The Americans quickly realized they were facing a new type of defense. Unlike previous battles in the Pacific, where the Japanese often relied on banzai charges and frontal counterattacks, here they waged a methodical defensive war, utilizing every advantage of the terrain. It was a war of attrition, where every meter of territory had to be literally carved out at the cost of numerous sacrifices. Soon, the battlefield turned into a lunar landscape of craters, ruined fortifications, and scorched earth. Continuous rains transformed the soil into sticky mud, hindering the movement of equipment. Soldiers on both sides lived and fought in this hell, suffering not only from enemy fire, but also from disease, lack of drinking water, and psychological exhaustion. In April 1945, the Japanese command launched an operation that was supposed to turn the tide of the Battle of Okinawa. The codename Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum, became a symbol of the desperate attempt of the Empire of the Rising Sun to stop the American invasion. The main striking force of this operation were the kamikaze pilots, the divine wind, ready to sacrifice themselves in the name of the Emperor and the homeland. On April 6th, more than 300 aircraft took off from airfields in Kyushu and Formosa, heading for the American fleet off the coast of Okinawa. This was the first wave of a massive kamikaze attack named Kikusui-1. Young pilots, many of whom had only minimal flight training, steered their explosives-laden machines directly onto the decks of American ships. American radar detected the approaching Japanese aircraft hundreds of kilometers away. Fighters scrambled, and the ship's anti-aircraft guns were brought to full combat readiness. The sky over Okinawa turned into a deadly labyrinth, of tracer bullets and anti-aircraft shell bursts. Despite the powerful anti-aircraft defense, dozens of kamikazes broke through to their targets. The destroyer Bush sustained critical damage from a direct hit and later sank. The aircraft carrier Hancock was damaged in an attack that claimed the lives of 62 sailors. In total, on this day, the American fleet lost several ships and about 400 men killed and wounded. The psychological effect of the kamikaze attacks turned out to be even stronger than the material damage. Sailors lived in constant tension, not knowing when the next plane would suddenly emerge from the clouds and head straight for their ship. Many suffered from nervous exhaustion, unable to withstand the constant stress. The Americans quickly adapted their countermeasures tactics. A multi-layered defense system was created. The outer ring consisted of patrol aircraft barraging the approaches to the fleet. The middle ring was formed by fighters on duty directly above the ship formation. The inner ring consisted of the anti-aircraft fire of the ships themselves. Special decoy ships were allocated to protect particularly valuable ships, aircraft carriers, and troop transports. These destroyers and cruisers intentionally took positions in the path of anticipated kamikaze attacks, absorbing the impact themselves. The crews of these ships suffered the heaviest losses. The Japanese did not limit themselves to one attack. Throughout April and May, 10 large-scale kikusui operations were carried out, involving more than 1,500 kamikaze aircraft. The peak occurred on April 12th, when during Operation Kikusui II, the Japanese sank or severely damaged more than 10 American ships. The air war over Okinawa became a real test for both sides. American pilots shot down dozens of Japanese planes, but new ones constantly appeared. Japanese pilots, knowing of their imminent death, displayed incredible courage, maneuvering under heavy anti-aircraft fire to reach their targets. On April 7, 1945, the Japanese command made a decision that forever entered history as a symbol of desperate courage and the empire's doom. The battleship Yamato, the pride of the Japanese fleet, the most powerful warship of its time, received orders to sail to the shores of Okinawa on a suicidal mission. The operation was codenamed, "Zero." The objective was crystal clear: to break through to the shores of Okinawa, run the ship aground, and turn it into a stationary artillery battery to support ground troops with fire for as long as possible. Fuel was allocated only for a one-way trip. A return was not anticipated. The crew understood it was a one-way ticket. The battleship was accompanied by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. No air cover was provided. Almost all aircraft had been committed to the, "2" operations against the American fleet. The command understood the mission's futility, but in the spirit of Japanese military traditions, believed that a heroic death was better than inaction. On the morning of April 8, the formation was discovered by the American submarine Thresher, and soon after by reconnaissance planes. Information about the Japanese squadron's movement instantly reached the American command. Hundreds of aircraft from the carriers Essex, Bunker Hill, Hancock, and Cabot took to the air. Wave after wave, bombers, torpedo bombers, fighters rushed towards the Yamato. At noon, the first American planes appeared over the Japanese squadron. An unequal battle began. The anti-aircraft guns of the Yamato and accompanying ships created a wall of fire, but it could not stop the armada of nearly 400 aircraft. American pilots attacked methodically and deliberately. The escort ships were the first targets. The cruiser Yahagi received several torpedo hits and soon sank. One by one, the destroyers went down. The Yamato was left practically alone against the aerial armada. Its giant main-caliber guns capable of firing shells weighing over a ton, were powerless against the nimble aircraft. The battleship maneuvered, trying to evade torpedoes, but its enormous size made this almost impossible. The first torpedo hit the port side. Several more followed. Bombs pierced the decks, causing fires. Despite the damage, the colossal ship continued to move and fired all its guns. The crew fought with incredible courage, understanding the inevitability of doom. By 2 p.m., the Yamato had received no less than 10 torpedo and bomb hits. The ship lost headway and began to list to port. When the list reached 60 degrees, disaster struck. The ammunition magazines detonated. A gigantic explosion, visible for hundreds of kilometers, literally tore the ship apart. A column of smoke rose several kilometers high, resembling a mushroom cloud. The Yamato went under the water, along with most of its crew. Out of 2,700 men, only about 280 were saved. The sinking of the Yamato was not just the loss of a warship, it was the symbolic end of Japanese naval power. The ship, which had consumed colossal resources in its construction, which embodied Japan's power and technological superiority, was destroyed without firing a single shot at enemy ships. For the Japanese, this was a devastating moral blow. The very idea of sending the pride of the fleet on a clearly suicidal mission indicated that the empire had exhausted all resources and capabilities. For the Americans, the destruction of the Yamato was proof of absolute dominance in the air and at sea. The Battle of Okinawa continued, but the symbolic point in the naval confrontation had been made. The path to the Japanese islands was open. The Shigarami Ridge and Sugarloaf Hill. These names are forever etched in history as symbols of one of the bloodiest episodes of the Battle of Okinawa. In the southern part of the island, where the Japanese had created an impregnable defensive line, the American Marines encountered an enemy ready to fight to the last man. In early May of '45, the 6th Marine Division was tasked with capturing the height nicknamed Sugarloaf due to its characteristic conical shape. This small elevation, only 150 meters high, dominated the surrounding terrain and was key to the Japanese defensive system. General Lemuel Shepard, the division commander, understood that without capturing this height, further advance was impossible. The Japanese had turned Sugarloaf into a veritable fortress. The slopes of the hill were riddled with trenches, caves, and bunkers. Dozens of machine gun nests swept all approaches. Artillery, hidden in caves, could fire upon advancing troops, remaining invulnerable to return fire. Underground tunnels allowed defenders to move unnoticed between positions. The Marines called their assault tactics blood and guts, a direct frontal attack despite losses. There was simply no other choice. Airstrikes and artillery bombardments proved largely ineffective against fortifications carved into the bedrock. Flamethrower tanks could not overcome the steep slopes and deep anti-tank ditches. On May 7th, the first assault began. Under the cover of artillery fire, Marine companies moved forward. As soon as the Americans entered the open ground, the Japanese unleashed a hurricane of fire. Machine gun bursts mowed down the advancing troops, mortar shells exploded among the attacking groups, snipers methodically picked off officers and radio operators. Despite monstrous losses, the Marines continued the attack. They used every fold in the terrain, every rock as cover, slowly advancing. Flamethrower operators burned out Japanese positions one by one. Sappers placed explosives at cave entrances, burying defenders alive. By evening, the Americans had secured the lower slopes of the hill, but the summit remained inaccessible. Over the next 3 days, the Marines launched 6 more attacks. Each brought only minor advances at the cost of dozens of lives. Companies melted away before their eyes. In some platoons, only 5 or 6 men remained in formation. Battalion commanders personally led their men into the attack, trying to inspire them by example. One of the participants in these battles, Sergeant Robert Livingston, later recalled, "It wasn't a battle, but some kind of madness. We attacked, retreated, attacked again. The ground was literally saturated with blood. The dead lay everywhere, and we used their bodies as cover during subsequent attacks. No one believed they would survive." The Japanese fought with incredible tenacity. Even the seriously wounded continued to fire until their last bullet, and then blew themselves up with grenades to avoid capture. At night, they made sallies, finishing off wounded Americans and collecting weapons and ammunition. By the end of May 1945, General Mitsuru Ushijima faced a critical situation. The Americans, despite heavy losses, were slowly pushing through the Shuri line. The Japanese defenders' ammunition was running low, casualties were mounting, and no reinforcements were forthcoming. The commander made a difficult but strategically sound decision: to organize a tactical retreat to the southern tip of the island. The operation began on the night of May 22nd to 23rd. Under the cover of darkness, Japanese units began a stealthy withdrawal from their positions. Carefully camouflaged rearguard units remained on the Shuri line, continuing to fire, creating the illusion of a full-scale defense. The Americans, exhausted by continuous fighting, did not immediately notice the enemy's maneuver. Nature seemed to conspire to help the retreating Japanese. In late May, torrential rains, characteristic of the region, lashed Okinawa. In a few days, 2 months' worth of precipitation fell. Battlefields turned into a viscous quagmire of mud. Roads became impassable. American tanks and artillery tractors got stuck in the deep mire. Supplies to forward units were threatened with disruption. "This is not rain, but a real flood," wrote American Marine Eugene Sledge in his diary. "Our trenches filled with knee-deep water. Weapons rust in a matter of hours. Wounds fester before they can heal. We live like rats in a sewer." For the Japanese, these weather conditions became a salvation. Columns of retreating troops, moving along mountain paths inaccessible to heavy equipment, were able to break away from pursuit. American aerial reconnaissance was paralyzed by low clouds and continuous downpours. When, on May 29th, American units finally broke through the Shuri line and captured the ancient castle, they found only empty fortifications and the bodies of the dead. General Ushijima skillfully organized the retreat. More than 70,000 soldiers, with heavy weaponry and wounded, were able to retreat to prepared positions on the Kion Peninsula at the southern tip of Okinawa. This narrow, rocky peninsula with its jagged coastline was an ideal place for a last stand. The American command was disappointed. The breakthrough of the Shuri line, which cost thousands of lives, did not bring a decisive victory. Instead, a new bloody battle awaited them in even more difficult conditions. General Buckner ordered his exhausted troops to regroup and prepare for the assault on the last Japanese bastion. In their new positions, the Japanese created a 3-tiered defense system, utilizing numerous natural caves and rock crevices. Every height was transformed into a fortified area. The remaining artillery pieces were carefully camouflaged and zeroed in on all possible American attack routes. Despite the critical situation, the morale of the Japanese soldiers remained high. They understood that there was nowhere left to retreat, only the sea behind them. Each was ready to fight to the last bullet, and then use a bayonet or grenade for suicide. Among all the tragedies of the Battle of Okinawa, the fate of the civilian population became one of the darkest pages. over 450,000 civilians found themselves caught between two ruthless forces, the American war machine and the fanatical Japanese army, ready to fight to the last man. Okinawans, who had their own culture and identity, distinct from Japanese, became involuntary hostages in someone else's war. Japanese propaganda had for years instilled in the local population that Americans were demons in human form, who would brutally treat prisoners and civilians. Teachers in schools told children horrifying stories about what awaited them if they surrendered. Many civilians were given hand grenades or capsules of poison, not to fight the enemy, but for suicide. When American troops began to advance deeper into the island, the unthinkable happened. Entire families committed mass suicides. Mothers killed their children and then themselves. Elderly people threw themselves off cliffs. Young people blew themselves up with grenades. By various estimates, 10 to 30,000 civilians died in this way, not at the hands of the enemy, but out of fear of them. The fate of the villagers in the south of the island was particularly tragic. Japanese soldiers drove them out of their shelters, accusing them of spying for the Americans if they tried to surrender. Thousands of refugees hid in caves, suffering from hunger, disease, and artillery shelling. Water became a precious commodity. People collected it drop by drop, dripping from the cave walls. The American command, faced with an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe, tried to organize refugee camps in the northern, already occupied part of the island. Using loudspeakers and leaflets, they urged civilians to surrender, promising medical aid and food. But Japanese officers shot those who tried to cross the front line. Many Okinawans found themselves in a terrifying situation. The Japanese considered them traitors for wanting to surrender, while the Americans sometimes mistook them for Japanese soldiers in civilian clothes. By mid-May, over 100,000 Okinawans were in displaced persons camps. Conditions were harsh. There was a shortage of medicine, food, and clean water. Epidemics of malaria and dysentery claimed the lives of weakened people. Children and the elderly suffered especially hard. The cultural and linguistic difference between Okinawans and Japanese exacerbated the situation. Many island residents did not understand the Japanese language in which evacuation orders were given. Americans, not distinguishing the nuances of local culture, often treated Okinawans as Japanese, causing distrust and fear. The tragedy of the civilian population of Okinawa became one of the most terrible illustrations of how civilians become victims of war propaganda and fanaticism. After the war, surviving Okinawans recounted how Japanese teachers taught schoolchildren how to properly hold grenades to blow themselves up if Americans approached, how soldiers threatened to shoot those who wanted to surrender, how entire villages decided on collective suicide after stories of American atrocities. When the fighting ended, the island lay in ruins. A third of the population died. The survivors lost homes, property, loved ones. Ancient cultural monuments, including Shuri Castle, were wiped off the face of the earth. Okinawa, once called the Island of Longevity, became an island of sorrow. By mid-June 1945, the Battle of Okinawa entered its final phase. The Kiyan Peninsula, at the southern tip of the island, became the last refuge for the remnants of the Japanese army. Thousands of soldiers were concentrated in an area of just a few square kilometers, squeezed between the sea and the advancing American divisions. Nature seemed to have created this place for a last stand. The rocky landscape with numerous caves and narrow gorges transformed into a labyrinth of fortifications. The Japanese used every crevice, every ledge to create firing positions. Underground tunnels connected key positions, allowing defenders to move unnoticed under continuous bombardment. The American offensive developed like a vice. The 6th Marine Division advanced from the west, the 7th Infantry Division from the east, and the 1st Marine Division attacked from the north. This tactic was called Scorpion. The scorpion's tail symbolized the deadly sting of Japanese counterattacks. It was during these days that Japanese resistance reached the peak of desperation. Knowing of their imminent defeat, soldiers of the Imperial Army undertook suicidal counterattacks. At night, small groups of 10 to 15 men shouting, quote, threw themselves at American positions. Armed only with rifles, bayonets, and hand grenades, they sought to take as many enemies with them as possible. One such attack on the night of June 18th nearly led to a breakthrough of the American defenses. About 300 Japanese soldiers, having broken through the forward posts, attacked the headquarters of an artillery battalion. Dozens of Americans, including several senior officers, died in hand-to-hand combat. Only at dawn was the attack repelled. As the encirclement tightened, the defenders' situation became increasingly hopeless. Ammunition, food, and medicine ran out. The wounded died without basic medical care. Water became a precious commodity. Soldiers collected rainwater or risked their lives, making their way to sources under enemy fire. On June 21st, General Ushijima convened the last war council in his underground command post. General Cho, his chief of staff, who was present, proposed a final massive counterattack with all remaining forces. Ushijima rejected this plan as hopeless. Instead, he ordered all those capable of bearing arms to continue resistance in small groups, maximally prolonging the agony of the battle. During these same days, the tragic epic of mass ritual suicides among Japanese officers began. Following the Bushido Code, they preferred death to captivity. The ceremony was performed according to a strict ritual. The officer donned his dress uniform, wrote a farewell letter to his family or a poem, and then disemboweled himself with a short sword, a tanto. A comrade standing nearby decapitated the suicide with a sword stroke, relieving them of agony. On June 22nd, the Americans announced the end of organized resistance on Okinawa. However, isolated pockets of defense continued to fight. On this day, General Ushijima and General Cho decided to follow the samurai tradition. In the underground bunker that served as their headquarters, they held their last ceremony. Staff officers lined up in an honor guard. Ushijima, dressed in his dress uniform, read his last report to the emperor, in which he apologized for his inability to defend Okinawa. Then, both generals committed ritual suicide. Their adjutants, as custom dictated, decapitated their commanders with sword strokes. With the death of the Supreme Command, organized resistance practically ceased. Isolated groups of soldiers continued to fight, but their actions lacked coordination. Many, following the example of their commanders, chose suicide over captivity. The Battle of Okinawa, lasting 82 days, became one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. The price of this victory proved horrifying for both sides. American losses amounted to approximately 12,000 killed and over 36,000 wounded. The U.S. Navy lost 34 ships sunk and over 300 damaged, mostly from kamikaze attacks. Air forces lost over 760 aircraft. Japanese losses were catastrophic. Approximately 110,000 soldiers died, with only 8,000 surrendering. But the most terrible tragedy was that of the civilian population. Out of 450,000 Okinawans, almost a third perished. Compared to other battles of World War II, Okinawa stands out for its particular ferocity. On Iwo Jima, Americans lost about 7,000 killed in 36 days of fighting. In Normandy, during the first month after the landing, about 20,000. But nowhere was there such a percentage of civilian casualties. The psychological consequences of the battle proved no less devastating than the physical ones. Many surviving American soldiers suffered from what would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. Having witnessed mass suicides of civilians, having seen the fanatical resistance of the Japanese, they returned home changed people. Among the surviving Japanese soldiers and Okinawans, many suffered from psychological trauma for decades. Okinawa became a turning point in the decision to use atomic weapons. Analyzing the losses incurred in capturing a single island, the American command concluded that an invasion of the Japanese islands could cost 1 million American lives and many millions of Japanese lives. President Truman, after reviewing the report on losses in Okinawa, leaned towards the opinion that atomic bombing, despite its terrifying power, could save lives for both Americans and Japanese in the long run. Okinawa showed that Japan would fight to the last man. Every city, every village could turn into another Okinawa. Faced with this prospect, even moral doubts about the use of a new weapon of unprecedented destructive power paled. Historians still debate whether the decision to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was justified. But it is impossible to deny that the experience of Okinawa was one of the key factors influencing this decision. The Battle of Okinawa became the last major battle of World War II, and at the same time, the first battle of the Cold War, demonstrating to the world new methods of warfare and the price that must be paid for victory in modern conflicts. The Battle of Okinawa forever changed the course of World War II. Its strategic outcomes proved far more significant than merely seizing another Pacific island. Okinawa became the last major battle before the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, an operation codenamed Downfall. American command, analyzing the horrific losses sustained in capturing just one island, arrived at a sobering conclusion. An invasion of the Japanese mainland could cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of Japanese lives. It was the Okinawa experience that became one of the decisive factors pushing President Truman to use atomic weapons. The fanatical Japanese resistance, their readiness to fight to the last man, and the mass suicides of civilians convinced American leadership that a conventional invasion would lead to an unprecedented slaughter. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, leading to Japan's surrender without the need for a landing on its territory. For Okinawa itself, the end of the war did not bring immediate relief. The island, reduced to ruins, came under American occupation, which lasted until 1972. The Americans built the largest military bases in the Pacific region on Okinawa, many of which still exist today. These bases became the cornerstone of the American military presence in Asia during the Cold War and remain so today. For Okinawans, the post-war years proved to be a period of complex adaptation. Their unique culture, already under pressure from Japanese assimilation, now faced American influence. The island's indigenous inhabitants found themselves caught between two fires: the Japanese desire to integrate Okinawa into the national identity and the American military presence, which occupied a significant portion of the territory. The return of Okinawa to Japanese sovereignty in 1972 did not resolve all contradictions. American bases remained, occupying about 18% of the island's territory. They continue to evoke conflicting feelings among local residents. On the one hand, the bases provide economic benefits. On the other hand, they serve as a constant reminder of a tragic past and cause environmental and social problems. Today, Okinawa is a place of remembrance and reconciliation. The Peace Memorial Park, created at the site of the last battles, is visited annually by thousands of Japanese and Americans. The names of all those who died in the battle regardless of nationality, are carved into black granite walls, a reminder of the senselessness of war and the value of human life. The Battle of Okinawa left a deep mark on the collective memory of both nations. For Americans, it became a symbol of the highest price of victory, and a turning point in the decision to use atomic weapons. For Japanese, it was the last tragedy of the war before surrender, and the beginning of a new era. For Okinawans, it is an unhealing wound and a reminder of how ordinary people become hostages of big politics.